The dusty box sat untouched for decades in the basement archives of the Mississippi State Police Department. On a humid September morning in 2023, Detective Sarah Martinez pulled it from the shelf, her fingers leaving trails in the thick dust. She hadn't meant to find it. She'd been searching for files on a different cold case altogether. But something about the faded label caught her eye. Thompson, M. Closed 1963. Sarah settled at her desk, coffee growing cold beside her as she pored over the yellowed pages. The photographs made her stomach turn. A young black woman suspended from an old oak tree, her Sunday dress moving slightly in the breeze captured by the black and white film. The official report was brief, almost suspiciously so. Mary Thompson, age 28. Suicide by hanging. No foul play suspected. But things weren't adding up. Sarah noticed the peculiarities immediately. The angle of the rope, the missing shoe never logged into evidence, and most notably, the complete absence of any witness statements. For a small town where everyone knew everyone's business, the silence surrounding Marie Thompson's death was deafening. Digging deeper, Sarah found inconsistencies in the original detective's notes. The handwriting changed halfway through, as if someone else had completed the report. There were missing pages, carefully removed from the case file. Most puzzling was a crumpled note, stuck to the back of a photograph, with a hastily scrawled message. Check Street Mary's hospital records. MT. Sarah's phone buzzed, reminding her of a meeting, but she couldn't tear herself away. Her instincts, honed by 15 years on the force, were screaming that this wasn't a simple suicide. The way Marie's hands were positioned, the strange bruising patterns partially hidden by her collar, everything pointed to a staged scene. Later that evening, as Sarah walked to her car, an elderly janitor who'd worked at the station since the 60s stopped her. His hands trembled as he spoke. "I saw you with the Thompson box today. Be careful with that one, detective. Some stories don't want to be told." Before she could question him further, he shuffled away, leaving Sarah with more questions than answers. At home, Sarah spread the case files across her kitchen table. Her daughter's artwork hung cheerfully on the fridge, a stark contrast to the grim photographs before her. As she studied Marie's face, young, beautiful, with a hint of determination in her eyes, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky, and rain began to fall, as if the very heavens were responding to the uncovering of this long-buried secret. What had Mary Thompson discovered that was worth killing for? And more importantly, who had gone to such lengths to make her death look like suicide? Sarah glanced at her reflection in the window, determination setting in. She would find out, no matter the cost. Little did she know, this case would change not only her life, but would unravel a decades-old conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Mississippi's power structure. The real question wasn't who Mary Thompson was, it was who wanted her dead, and why they'd worked so hard to keep it quiet for 60 years. Sarah's breakthrough came at 3 a.m. in her dimly lit office. Cross-referencing old newspaper archives, she discovered something that made her spill her coffee. Mary Thompson wasn't just any victim. She was Dr. Marie Thompson, a graduate of Howard University with a Ph.D. in biochemistry, class of 1960. The same woman who had published groundbreaking research on cellular regeneration before mysteriously disappearing from the scientific community. But why was a brilliant scientist working as a cleaning lady at St. Mary's Hospital? The answer lay in a fragile, water-stained letter Sarah found tucked inside an old civil rights movement pamphlet. The letter, written in precise handwriting, detailed Marie's real mission. She had deliberately taken the menial job to document the horrifying medical practices being conducted on black patients without their knowledge or consent. Marie's journal entries, hidden within the case files under mundane labels, revealed her methodical mind. She recorded everything: unauthorized drug trials, experimental surgeries, and most disturbing of all, the deliberate withholding of treatment from critically ill patients. Each entry was written in a complex code, mixing medical terminology with what appeared to be cake recipes, a brilliant disguise that had fooled the police for decades. The more Sarah dug, the more she found. Photographs of Marie showed her in different settings, receiving her doctorate, speaking at scientific conferences, and then, abruptly, pushing a mop through hospital corridors. In one particular photo, Sarah noticed something peculiar. Marie's hand positioned oddly, holding what looked like a miniature camera disguised as a button on her uniform. One night, while interviewing elderly residents of the Black community, Sarah met Martha Johnson, now 92, who had worked alongside Marie. Martha's hands shook as she whispered, "Dr. Thompson wasn't just gathering evidence. She was building a case that would have brought down half the medical establishment in Mississippi. She had proof of doctors experimenting on children in the colored ward." But the most chilling discovery came from Marie's personal effects, finally released by an evidence clerk who kept them hidden all these years. Among them was a small notebook, its pages filled with names, dates, and detailed observations. In the margins, Marie had written a haunting note. "They're starting to watch me. If anything happens, remember, the truth is in the numbers." The final entry, dated just 3 days before her death, was particularly disturbing. "Dr. Henderson saw me in the restricted wing today. The look in his eyes. He knows. Must contact James tomorrow. The children in Ward C can't wait any longer." Sarah stood at her evidence board, photos and documents connected by red string, forming a web of conspiracy that stretched back 6 decades. She couldn't shake the image of Marie, a brilliant scientist working undercover, sacrificing everything to expose the truth. But somewhere in this town, there were people who had killed to keep their secrets buried. And they might still be watching. As if confirming her fears, Sarah's office phone rang. When she answered, there was only static, followed by a gravelly voice. "Some boxes should stay closed, detective." The pieces fell into place one rainy evening when Sarah found a crumbling police logbook from 1963. 3 officers had been assigned to patrol St. Mary's Hospital the night before Marie's death. Officers James Whittaker, Ronald Daniels, and George Thompson, no relation to Marie. Their patrol routes changed mysteriously that night, all converging on the hospital's restricted wing. Sarah tracked down Officer Whittaker's grandson, now a bank manager in Jackson. In his grandfather's belongings, he'd found an old tin box containing photographs, ones that were never meant to be seen. They showed Mary being confronted by the 3 officers in the hospital's basement. Her research documents were scattered across a metal table, and the look of defiance on her face spoke volumes. The truth hit Sarah like a thunderbolt. Marie had been collecting more than just evidence of medical malpractice. She'd uncovered a massive network of illegal drug testing, with St. Mary's as the epicenter. Local police weren't just looking the other way. They were actively involved, providing security and helping dispose of records. Phone records from that era, preserved by a meticulous courthouse clerk, showed frantic calls between the hospital administrator and these 3 officers the night Marie died. A torn memo, found in Officer Daniels' old desk, read, "Thompson knows too much. Handle it quietly." No traces. Sarah interviewed a retired nurse, Emma Williams, who'd worked the night shift. Emma, now in her 80s, spoke in whispers even decades later. "I saw them drag her out the back door," she said, her hands trembling around her teacup. She was still holding her notebook, fighting them every step. Officer Whittaker kept saying, "You should have stayed in your lane, girl." The deeper Sarah dug, the darker it got. The officers had discovered Mary photographing documents in the hospital's restricted wing. Files that proved the hospital was using Black patients as unwitting test subjects for new drugs. Local judges, politicians, and business leaders were all implicated. The profits from these illegal trials had built half the town's infrastructure. Most chilling was the revelation about Officer George Thompson. His police notebook, found in his widow's attic, contained a detailed plan for that night. They hadn't just killed Marie. They'd choreographed every detail to send a message to others who might follow in her footsteps. The hanging wasn't just a murder, it was a warning. But they'd made one crucial mistake. In their haste to silence Marie, they'd overlooked a small package she'd mailed to her sister in Chicago the day before her death. Sarah's heart raced when she found the certified mail receipt tucked into the original case file. Now, after all these years, she just had to find out if that package had ever arrived, and if it still existed. The cover-up unraveled like a cheap sweater when Sarah discovered a hidden vault in the old police station's evidence room. Behind a false wall, she found boxes of original crime scene photos, not the doctored versions in the official file. These showed Marie's true wounds, defensive marks on her hands, and signs of a violent struggle that had been carefully edited out of the official record. A retired crime scene photographer, Bill Jenkins, finally broke his silence after 60 years. His hand shook as he described that night. "They made me photograph her twice. First, how we found her, then again after they'd cleaned things up. They watched me develop both sets, made sure I understood which ones would go in the official record. Then they kept my originals." The threats had been ruthlessly effective. Marie's research assistant, a young man named Marcus, had been planning to continue her work. The morning after her death, he found his family's cat hanging from his front porch, wearing Marie's missing shoe. He left town that same day, never to return. Local newspaper archives told their own story of deception. The editor had initially written a detailed article about Marie's death, raising questions about the suspicious circumstances. That article never ran. Instead, a brief 3-line notice appeared on page 6. Local cleaning woman found deceased. No foul play suspected. The editor's son later told Sarah his father had received a midnight visit from officers Whitaker and Daniels, along with an envelope full of cash. The hospital administrators had played their part perfectly. They'd quickly cleaned out Marie's locker, destroying her notes and photographs. Her personal belongings vanished. When her family came asking questions, they were handed a box containing only her uniform and a few mundane personal items. Her research materials, documentation of the illegal experiments, and the damning evidence she'd collected all disappeared. But the most disturbing evidence of the cover-up came from Dorothy Williams, a janitor who'd worked the night shift. She'd seen Marie's body before the police arrived, still wearing her wire-rimmed glasses. In the official photos, the glasses were gone. "They took them," Dorothy whispered to Sarah. "Said they had to check them for evidence. But I saw Officer Daniels drop them down a storm drain. They knew she'd used those glasses to take pictures. Had a tiny camera built right into the frame." The truth had been buried under layers of threats, bribes, and carefully constructed lies. But now, 60 years later, those lies were beginning to crack. And Sarah noticed something else. People were starting to disappear again. Anyone she interviewed seemed to vanish or fall silent within days. The cover-up wasn't just history. It was still active, still protecting someone or something. The breakthrough came in Marie's family recipe book, a worn notebook Sarah found in her sister's attic in Chicago. At first glance, it contained simple Southern cooking instructions: cornbread, collard greens, sweet potato pie. But Sarah noticed something odd about the measurements. They didn't make sense for cooking. Late one night, after her third cup of coffee, Sarah realized the truth. The recipes were Marie's research notes in code. 2 cups of flour actually meant 2 doctors involved. 3 tablespoons of sugar translated to 3 unauthorized drug trials. The cooking temperatures were patient room numbers. Marie had hidden her evidence in plain sight, disguising it as family traditions. The most damning evidence was hidden in a recipe for Grandma's special peach cobbler. The ingredient list contained the names of 12 children who had died during secret vaccine trials. The cooking instructions detailed the exact medications used, dosages, and dates. In the margins, Marie had written what looked like cooking tips, but were actually the names of witnesses and locations of hidden documentation. Sarah brought in a cryptographer who specialized in Cold War-era codes. Together, they discovered that Marie had used a variation of a World War I cipher, one she would have learned about during her brief stint working with military medical researchers. The recipe book contained enough evidence to reopen not just her case, but hundreds of others. The code revealed something else. Marie had suspected she was being washed. The last recipe, dated the day before her death, included a special ingredient: photographs hidden in the base of her grandmother's old butter churn, still stored in her family's barn. When Sarah found the butter churn, she discovered a waterproof container with dozens of clear photographs showing hospital staff conducting unauthorized experiments. But the most shocking discovery wasn't in the recipes at all. It was what Marie had written in invisible ink between the lines. Using the UV light, Sarah revealed a message that made her blood run cold. They're not just testing drugs. They're testing something worse. The children in Ward C aren't sick. They're being made sick. God forgive me for not stopping this sooner. As Sarah pieced together the full scope of Marie's documentation, she realized this wasn't just about medical experiments. Marie had uncovered a statewide network of corruption, involving judges, police officials, and even a governor. The recipe book wasn't just evidence. It was a key to unraveling 60 years of coordinated criminal activity. Sarah found former Officer Ronald Daniels living in a luxurious retirement community in Florida. At 85, he still had the stern face from his police photos, though now lined with age. She watched him from her car as he played golf, living free while Marie's family had suffered for decades. Officer Whitaker had passed away years ago, but George Thompson was alive, residing in a small town just outside Jackson. Building the case wasn't easy. Most physical evidence had been destroyed, but Marie's encoded recipes and the hidden photographs provided a foundation. Sarah tracked down surviving family members of the children mentioned in the grandma's special peach cobbler recipe. Each family had a similar story. A child admitted for minor symptoms, unexpected complications, and then death. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Thompson's wife, Patricia, suffering from dementia, had been rambling about that night to her nurses. Sarah visited her, pretending to be an old friend. Between confused memories, Patricia revealed crucial details. Her husband had come home late that night, burning his uniform in the backyard. He'd been drinking heavily, muttering about that Thompson girl and how she should have just kept quiet. Former Officer Thompson broke under questioning. Age had weakened his resolve, and guilt had eaten at him for decades. He confessed to his role in Marie's death, providing details that matched the evidence Sarah had uncovered. Daniels was arrested during his morning golf game, still protesting his innocence even as the handcuffs clicked shut. The district attorney was hesitant to prosecute such an old case, but public pressure mounted as the story spread. Civil rights organizations rallied behind Marie's family. 27 surviving victims of the hospital's experiments came forward, their testimonies corroborating Marie's documentation. The trial was intense. Sarah testified for 6 hours, methodically presenting the decoded evidence. The defense tried to discredit Marie's character, but her impeccable academic record and the testimony of former colleagues painted a picture of a brilliant scientist who'd sacrificed everything to expose the truth. Thompson and Daniels were found guilty. The judge, a black woman whose own aunt had died mysteriously at St. Mary's in 1962, delivered a powerful sentence: life imprisonment. Justice delayed, she declared, is still justice. On a bright spring morning in 2024, hundreds gathered for the inauguration of the Dr. Marie Thompson Center for Medical Ethics at Howard University. Sarah stood among Marie's surviving family members, watching as Marie's great-niece cut the ribbon. The building would house not just a research facility, but also a museum documenting the dark history of medical experimentation on minority communities. Marie's decoded recipe book became the centerpiece of the museum's main exhibition. Each recipe, now fully translated, told stories of courage, tragedy, and finally, justice. Visitors could see the hidden meanings revealed through interactive displays, understanding how a brilliant scientist had turned everyday recipes into a powerful testimony against systemic abuse. The impact of Marie's work rippled through the medical community. 3 major hospitals in Mississippi faced investigations into their historical practices. The state legislature passed the Mary Thompson Transparency Act, requiring strict oversight of all medical research and mandatory disclosure of past unethical practices. Families who had lost loved ones at St. Mary's finally learned the truth about their relatives' deaths. Sarah's investigation led to more than just criminal convictions. A review of hospital records from the 1960s identified over 200 victims of unauthorized experiments. A compensation fund was established, though no amount of money could erase decades of suffering. More importantly, Marie's detailed documentation helped modern medical researchers understand and prevent similar abuses. In universities across the country, Marie's story became part of the medical ethics curriculum. Students learned not just about the horrors she uncovered, but about her ingenious methods of documentation. Her recipe code was studied as an example of how determination and creativity could serve justice, even in the most oppressive circumstances. The most touching tribute came from the families of the children mentioned in the peach cobbler recipe. They established a scholarship in Marie's name, sending minority students to medical school. The first recipient was the granddaughter of one of those children, now pursuing her dream of becoming a medical researcher. On the anniversary of Marie's death each year, people gather at the old oak tree, now adorned with a bronze plaque telling her true story. They bring recipes, real ones, sharing food and memories, transforming a place of tragedy into one of community and healing. Mary Thompson's legacy lives on, not just in the laws and institutions bearing her name, but in every medical student who learns to prioritize ethics over expedience, and in every whistleblower who finds the courage to speak truth to power.